I'm excited to introduce Rex Storm, and Rex is going to be one of our moderators for this afternoon session. Rex and Glenn are going to work together for the afternoon, and Rex, as many of you know, is Executive Vice President for Associated Oregon Loggers, and he's based there in Salem, but Rex has traveled all over our state helping forest operators and contractors, and really has been an important part of this sector for 25 plus years, and really has been working in every avenue of AOL and now as their leader. And Rex brings a lot of great kind of crossroads between forestry, the profession, the logging contractors, the operators, and can bring forth a lot of great knowledge and information. And he's also a small family forest landowner himself and serves on many boards to help represent landowners across the state. So with that, Rex, I appreciate you being here, Rex, and we'll hand it over to you for our afternoon session.
All right, thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the general session panel, Water, Fire, and Research. We have 2.5 hours ahead in this session, concluding by 4 p.m. You're going to visit the McMinnville Watershed by virtual tour. Then you'll hear about a post-fire assessment and management impacts on water resources. And lastly, this session will explore Trees to Tap. Trees to Tap is a joint project by Oregon State University, College of Forestry, and Oregon Forest Resource Institute to learn about forest management and community drinking water. So my next mission is to introduce Glenn Ahrens. Glenn is Extension Forester with Oregon State University Extension Service, servicing Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties. Glenn's also director of the OSU Hardwood Silviculture Cooperative. Glenn has over 35 years of experience in forestry, in research and extension, and private consulting. Glenn's specialties are many. His specialties include forest ecology, silviculture, vegetation management, and hardwood management. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Glenn, and Glenn's going to do the hard work.
All right. Thank you, Rex. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here on this virtual conference, and it's been great so far, so we hope to continue. So my first step here is just to introduce our virtual watershed tour. Of course, we were going to have a field tour as part of the conference, and instead we got to go out with a videographer, and I want to thank Pat McAberry for doing the video work. Also note he's a firefighter, so soon after that he was out on fires with a lot of you. And then I'll introduce Brent Keller. Of course, you'll get to know him better when you just get on this video tour, but I'll start out, Brent, and just introduce you. So Brent's a forester with Mason, Bruce, and Girard, and he's got over 25 years of experience in forest management. He's been with MB&G for 21 years. His land management project experience, covers all the bases of forestry. He's worked throughout the Western U.S., Alaska, and Canada, managing forests for a variety of clients, both private, industrial, non-industrial, municipal clients. So as you'll see with the McMinnville Watershed, that's a special kind of municipal client. And he also helps with, advisory committees, working with local schools and also the Clackamas County Forest Program. Brent, I just ask you to say hello just to make sure that your microphone works before we go into the video.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Brent Keller.
All right, glad to see you're there. He's just joining us on phone, so now, Brent, you'll just have to listen into the video, and then we'll be there for the Q&A after. So with that, let's just start our virtual tour of the McMinnville Forest Watershed. And Julie, if you could cue that up, we'll see if we can make that technology work.
Good morning, I'm Glenn Ahrens, OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River County, and also a SAF member and helping out with our virtual field tour today for the OSAF Conference 2020. And my pleasure to introduce our host here on the Watershed, Brent Keller.
My name is Brent Keller. I've been with Mason, Bruce, and Girard since 1993, and I work managing McMinnville Watershed. Mason, Bruce, and Girard has managed McMinnville Watershed forestry since 1965.
So the McMinnville watershed is one of your major clients for Mason, Bruce, and Girard?
Yes, we manage several watersheds around the region, but McMinnville would be the most prominent.
And how long have you been managing the McMinnville watershed forest?
I've been working out in the watershed since the mid-90s and directly managing since 2011.
And what does all that involve for you? What are your basic duties here managing this watershed forest?
We have a timber program annually, cut 4 to 5 million feet every year, and then everything that goes with that, the road maintenance, silviculture, forest planning, harvest scheduling, contracting, managing the logging, so on.
So you cover all the bases to manage the forest.
So I'm all the departments. Yep.
All right. Why don't you tell us about the watershed, the setting here, and the acreage, et cetera?
We're situated sort of at the summit of the Coast Range. We've got about 6,500 acres between the Nestucca side of the watershed, the McGuire Reservoir side, and the Haskins side. There's about 4,500 acres in the Haskins watershed, and that's entirely owned by City of McMinnville, and then a couple thousand acres in the Nestucca drainage. The Nestucca drains to the west, out to the ocean, and Haskins, pretty unique feature. You know, geologically, it drains to the east into the Yamhill River and out to the Willamette, and it's 95% Doug fir.
Very good. You mentioned since 1965. Can you tell us about how long the city is, when this watershed started, and how long they've been managing the water system?
So in the 1920s, they started accumulating small parcels from homesteaders and ranchers. I think there was some opportunities to acquire land that had been defaulted on tax-wise, and they got the ball rolling there. And then over the years, they had land exchanges with the Bureau of Land Management and some land trades with Willamette Industries, and bought some land from Willamette as well to eventually solidify that 6,500 acre ownership.
So when did the city of McMinnville really solidify this watershed and build the reservoir and really get the water system as it is today going?
So in the 1920s, they built the initial dam on Haskins Creek, and then I think rebuilt that and replaced it to what it is today in the 1950s, and then dammed up the water on the Nestucca River in 1970 or so, and then raised the dam, doubling the amount of capacity in this reservoir right around 2000. The water from McGuire Reservoir is just stored here and then piped across the watershed down Idlewild Creek into Haskins Reservoir, and from there the water that's accumulated at Haskins and then brought over from McGuire is treated and sent down to the city.
And what kind of forest management was practiced? So it really got solidified in 1970, it sounds like, with this last reservoir. And then what was the earlier forest management like before you came and took over here?
So in the 50s, the city contracted with a logger to do salvage of the Nestucca burn, which is the origin of this watershed. That was a 10 or 15 year contract. In the mid-60s, 65, they decided to sign on with Mason, Bruce, and Girard to do active annual forest management. And so the first harvest was in the mid-60s. And so that was an annual harvest program of a lot of salvage and SST, salvage, sanitation, thinning operation with some smaller clear cuts in areas. And then in 1981, established the management plan we work under today. And the main goals of the watershed is to provide water, that's the #1 priority, and promote fish and wildlife, and provide a vigorous and ecologically diverse forest. And just by virtue of that, you provide the quality water to the city, just through that diversity and vigor of the forest.
And you mentioned the timber harvest, so there is an active timber harvest program. And what's the basic approach there? The yield, the annual harvest, sustained yield that you're working with?
So we're pretty conservative on the annual harvest level. The management plan that was established in the early 80s and the inventory that determined the annual harvest level was calculated at 4.5 to 5 million board feet. We generally cut around 4 million feet a year, which is well within the sustainable level. Usually do two timber sales each year, plus some salvage. At times we've done poling in some of the older stands, and focus on small clear cuts and selective harvest.
All right, well, tell us about the unit here.
This stand right in front of us was harvested 2013 and planted 2014, then was interplanted 2015 again. We had some boomer damage. We trapped the mountain beavers out of here, and since then we've great success. We did have one entry of hand slashing to eliminate the competing brush, mostly Scotch broom, and so you can see now it's free to grow and see 3 to 4 foot leaders on the trees. And so our next entry here would be in probably about 15 years when pre-commercial thin.
Well, first just tell us about this reforestation unit that we're in and the operations that you do here and how you do them.
Okay. Well, this particular unit we're in is about 10 acres. Was cut 2012. Was interplanted 2 or 3 times. We've hand slashed the brush in this unit. We don't do any spraying, no herbicide treatments in the watershed. So all the vegetation management we do is by hand with just hand crews, chainsaws, and so that's how we attack it. It can be labor intensive. We're on top of our regeneration survival pretty intensely. We'll, after a planting in the spring, next fall, we'll do a regen survey. If the plantation is less than 300 trees per acre, we'll plan to interplant it the next winter. That next fall, we'll do a regen survey again. If it's good, if it has more than 300 trees per acre, we won't interplant it, but the next fall after that, we'll do one more regen survey. And until we have 2 regen surveys in consecutive years with more than 300 trees per acre, we keep interplanting and keep after it. By about 5 years or so, we need to do the hand slashing generally. One technique we use for maple sprouts is we'll leave the main maple sprout and cut the rest. The idea being we force the growth into that one maple sprout. That's a technique we use to try to attack the maple. Otherwise, we're just trying to get the brush down and get the trees above the brush to beat the brush. So you can see here across this landscape, we're standing in about between 5 and 10 year plantation. Below us is a 25 to 30 year old stand, and then another 5 to 10 year, then a 20 year stand, and up the top of the horizon there is a 150 year old. We practice what I'd refer to as an enhanced green up in the watershed, where we do everything we can to avoid cutting next to a previous clear cut until the trees are 10, 15 feet tall versus the 4 foot or so green up rules that the practice rules provide. So it's a little gentler approach. Again, the priority here is to create a vigorous forest with ecological diversity, and by virtue of that, if we do that through moving our clear cuts around, keeping them small, and with that enhanced green up, then we'll produce good water for the city.
In terms of the operation, when you do a small clear cut like this, what measures are you taking to ensure good water quality, to protect the water, in terms of the operation, time of year, kinds of equipment, that kind of thing?
So to protect the resource in terms of the harvesting, within the units, it's not a whole lot different from industry. We have a little stricter rules on where you need to have cable versus shovel. But in general, it's very similar. But the key differences are that enhanced green up, the size of the clear cuts, and the timing. We have an operating season of May through September, so there's no winter logging. That protects our roads, protects from sediment delivery, erosion, those types of things.
How about your rotation age? You mentioned that stand up there is 150. You talked about having diversity in your stand types and doing partial selective harvesting as well as clear cutting. So what kind of a rotation age does the watershed have overall?
So at a minimum, we'll do an area control, so we're not cutting an amount that's going to leave us with any more than 1/70th of the watershed being cut per year. Some years when we're cutting higher volume stands, you might be cutting 100th of the watershed acreage in a year, so you'd be on a 100-year rotation. But at a minimum, we're at a 75-year rotation or so.
And so this 10-acre unit, in order to get your average of 4 million board feet a year, about how many acres are you clear cut harvesting every year on average?
About 80, never more than 100 acres are we cutting in any one year, and that'd be 2 to 3, sometimes 4 units. Generally, we'll sell 2 sales, but that can be, like this year we have a sale that's 3 units within the one sale. So you might have 40 acres, but it's 15 acres, 8 acres, and 17 acres or something. So pretty low impact. Trying to move our units around the watershed. I think back years ago, one of the commissioners saying we don't want moonscapes out here. So I always kind of keep that in the back of my mind when we're laying out things across the landscape to create that diversity by moving our operations around.
And that enhanced green up would ensure that you're never going to see a lot of adjacent fresh clear cuts.
Right. I would point out this unit we're standing in, a lot of grass, a lot of browse. We interplanted, we slashed, and so to a lot of folks after 10 years, this would be kind of a rough clear cut, but to us, this is a success. We got full stocking, we're on an 80-year rotation, so it's not a concern with our values that we have, the amount of growth that you'd expect in industrial plantation.
Well, it looks like we're in one of your older stands, so why don't you tell us about this stand and about the landscape of the older stand contingent that you have and where that fits in your management.
So we have about 1,000 acres or better of 60-plus-year-old stands out of the 6,500 acres in the watershed. And this stand's 100 to 150 years old, was entered over the years for salvage, for poles, and some commercial thinning. So originally would have had 100,000 board feet to the acre or more. Now still at a final harvest would be 60 to 70,000 per acre. And our strategy for selecting stands, most of these really old stands are declining in terms of growth and health, and so we're trying to focus on the least healthy of those stands for harvest. Part of this stand will be harvested in the next few years. We do have to factor working in just this older type with our green up rules. So in some areas there's older pieces we'd like to get into sooner, but we're waiting for the adjacent stands to green up to a more of a 10, 15-year age before we go back in and take other neighboring older stands. To run through real quick the cycle of things. So we'd In terms of silviculture, up to final harvest, at this point, our rotation age is 70, 80 years of age. So at year 0, you'd be planting, and then those first 5 years probably doing quite a bit of interplanting and hand management of the slash. Of course, we don't spray chemicals or use any herbicides, pesticides. So by 5 to 10 years, the stands would be free to grow, off and running. Then between 15 and 25 years, we'd pre-commercial thin. And because of this interplanting and some of the areas being lower site, you can have a mixture of density and composition in those young stands. So some of those will actually lay out the PCT, where we paint the trees to leave or to take, because you can have 10-inch trees that you wouldn't want to thin at all in a stand right next to thickets of 5-inch trees that need to be pre-commercial thinned. And we do that 15 to 25 years of age, and then our next entry would be at 40 to 50 years for the first commercial entry, and maybe one more commercial entry before final harvest at age 80.
I notice on this, we're on a skid road here, and we haven't talked much about roads, but how do you manage your roads and your equipment to minimize sedimentation and other water quality impacts?
The main difference in what we would do versus industry is the timing. I think it's one big thing, one big way we can avoid sediment delivery and getting the most out of our roads and maintaining them is we have an operating season from May to September, October in there. Roads like we're standing on here are strictly summertime roads. You know, we're at the bottom of the better part of a mile of dirt road that's hasn't had any rock on it. It's not gonna have any rock on it. We're not gonna invest in that, and we don't need to be in here. Roads effectively closed for the entire rainy season. And so our rock roads, we have a rock pit, we crush rock, try to keep those maintained. We have some sediment traps in areas where we need to protect from sedimentation delivery to streams. How do you set up all your dirt roads so you make sure there's not going to be a blowout or something in the winter when you're not looking? We outslope them and grade them and water bar in, you know, where we need to along the roads so they hold up through the winter. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like a road like this, it's a historic situation where this road's been a dirt road for the life of the watershed, going back to probably the 50s. This was built when they were salvaging the old growth after the stucco burn. So you have a lot of legacy roads that you work with, mm-hmm. and keep your eye on those things. Mm-hmm. And some of these dirt roads do have pipes in them. Yeah, we'll put cross drains or culverts where we need to keep the water where it's supposed to be. I suppose part of your job is patrolling the system to be ready for the fall rains in the winter. Is that getting ready for winter? What do you do for that? Well, in the course of the operations of the logging, and as built into some of our timber sale contracts, we do a lot of road maintenance. So around this time, we'd be getting the road maintenance folks in as the logging's finishing up to rock, grade, reshape, roll a lot of the mainline roads. Look, we've got a pretty thorough strategy for evaluating the culverts and replacing those over time. We're kind of at a point now after 50 years since most of those went in that we're replacing a lot of them, and so we're just always evaluating and monitoring the culverts and ditches and making mm-hmm. sure everything's in good shape. Brent, you were saying that in addition to the clear cutting, you do a fair amount of selective harvesting and thinning. So why don't you tell us about how that fits into the management here? So in addition to the 2 small clear cuts we do every year, over the years we have done a fair amount of commercial thinning and salvage of dead, dying trees. Particularly in the last 15 years, did a lot of polling in stands like this, where we'd go in and take not every pole from the stand, but a certain amount of poles, leaving as a guideline like a 30-foot spacing between trees. And this particular stand here, we set out to do some pulling, and it turned into more of a salvage operation because there were a lot of dead, dying trees. It was at age 70 when we first entered here. It's at about 80 years old now. So this is a real good example of a commercial entry. And we wouldn't look to be back in here for final harvest. We could at any time. It's you know, at a good rotation age, but probably wouldn't be for another 10 years. We'd be in this type. There's older stands that are declining that we'd need to focus on first.
You mentioned removing the snags and also just salvaging or sanitizing. So what's your approach to managing the dead trees?
So we try to, in the course of being around here and managing things, capture those dead trees. A lot of times we can do that built into a final harvest. That's usually in the contract, that there might be 10, 20,000 feet worth of snags to get that are hopefully adjacent to in the general area of the clear cut operation, or maybe across the watershed. That might be just a separate project as part of a timber sale. When we were doing the pulling, we used the pole logger because they were already selectively logging to do some of the other salvage operation. And the idea being to we don't want to capture every snag, but in terms of maintaining forest health and trying to capture some of that value from the watershed to stay on top of that. A salvage program or operation is a function of having older timber. If our average age was 50 years old or our rotation age was 35 to 40, trees aren't maturing or declining at those ages. So
yeah, you wouldn't have much to salvage. What about retention of some snags for wildlife habitat, things like that?
So I think I've observed, don't get them all. They're not, a lot of the areas aren't operable to get snags, and so those remain, which is a good fit for wildlife. And then of course, we'd leave a lot of trees in our buffers, in the clear cuts per the rules, and leaving older trees as leaf trees, you end up with quite a few snags.
More snags.
So. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, this is recent 2020 clear cuts. It's just been logged and site prepped. We are going to burn the piles in this unit. We don't always burn, but this is a good fit for burning. A few unique things to our clear cuts versus industry clear cuts is we try real hard to leave any of the submerged conifer trees as advanced regeneration for the next rotation, and spend a lot of time doing brush eradication with the machine while they're out here piling. So the operator in this is a 40-acre unit. This would be pretty big for us in the watershed. He probably spent 3-4 days of just scarifying the soil to reduce the sallow and other brush that'll compete with the seedlings when we plant them. So that's the main things that are different here.
Well, it looks like we're at the bottom of the watershed and at the end of the line for the water supply. And Brent, why don't you tell us about the reservoir and the water that's provided by the watershed?
Okay, this is Haskins Reservoir. This is fed by Haskins Creek, and then Ottawald Creek carries the water that's transferred from McGuire Reservoir into Haskins Reservoir. And this holds about 250 million gallons. The treatment plant has a capacity to provide about 13 million gallons a day to the city of high quality water here from the Coast Range. The area above the reservoir here and most of the areas right around here are in reserve as far as timber management goes, and will never be harvested, just to safeguard against any erosion issues we might have. The dam here, the Link Dam was built, it's an earthen dam, was built right around 1950.
So in terms of the quality of the water, with the practices just in the forest itself providing high quality water, but things like turbidity or nutrients or other things that might affect water quality related to land management, So how are we doing? How is the water coming from this reservoir? Does it meet all the standards?
Well, it once upon a time, before it was a federal law that everyone had to treat their water, then a lot of the measures we took were highly critical to ensure you didn't have turbidity and water quality issues to town. Now they treat the water, but in general, except in extreme storm events, we don't have issues with turbidity or hard water or issues with abnormalities of mineral content or anything like that. So it's I think a high quality water product to the city.
Okay. In terms of the forest near the stream and the riparian buffers, what kind of management do you practice here on the watershed?
So we follow the practice rules. On a large fish stream, we'd be at a 100-foot buffer. One thing we don't ever do is push that within the 100 feet, or on a medium stream or the small stream rules, just the same. We don't try to go within the core and capture every last tree. And again, difference would be that timing of when we're operating. So we're operating the dry time of the year when there's less runoff, less sediment delivery to streams, and that makes a world of difference if you're not logging in the rainy season. So I think it's, again, our biggest distinction between us and your average timberland would be that ecological diversity within the watershed by moving our operations around and trying to have a vigorous forest, and then the timing of when we're working. So, but as far as our buffers go, they're the standard buffers provided by the practice rules.
And you're not actually doing any management in the entire 100 feet, or would you be thinning in the outer part of that buffer at all?
No.
So you leave the whole buffer
So we
untouched.
leave the entire buffer that, for example, on a large fish stream, 100 feet each side, we would be fixed at not going within that 100 feet.
So what is Haskin Creek as far as stream size?
That's large fish.
So the buffer that we're looking at from the aerial view there, that's the 100-foot buffer.
Right. Yep. At least. Now there are areas where it would be bigger due to landforms or something, but it's a minimum of 100 feet on the large fish.
So as a forester managing a city watershed, what kind of challenges do you encounter, maybe different from your other clients?
So it's certainly different in terms of the style of management. In terms of trying to maximize value, we're not as concerned with net present value as an industrial owner would be. Don't have the challenges of a real small landowner. But as far as it being difficult, it's a different form of management, but we've been doing it a long time, and I think it's a fairly simple program, and the city's been really supportive and easy to work with. And in terms of the challenges we have with silviculture and not spraying, and so we're doing more hand work, which costs more, but you still want a result that is productive in 10 years and into the future. The city and the commission has spared no expense on investing in their timberland, so that's made it a really easy process and a really satisfying forest to work in.
And I noticed your rotation is certainly longer than average for private, even conservative private landowners. We're looking at 150-year-old stands, 80-year-old stands, and some of those trees get really large. But it seems like you get a high value. So what kinds of values are you able to get a higher price for your older, higher quality wood?
So we've been able to capture that added value real well because we have a tight grain log that doesn't have a lot of knots and is real appealing to folks building higher end products, not just studs and dimension lumber, but material for timber frame homes and high-end windows and doors and those sorts of things. And then our pole program was hugely successful as well, because we've got a lot of 100 and 130-foot poles, and so we've been real fortunate to be able to provide that,
So
capture that value.
a benefit of the longer rotation forestry is that you truly are getting a higher price for a higher quality wood that you grow in a longer rotation.
Right. So it fits in real good with what we're trying to do anyway. Then we can actually capture that value and not have to send suppressed, slower growing, high quality logs just down to a stud mill.
Well, thanks, Julie. Glad that worked great on the second try. That was good. I really appreciate the work of everyone involved in making it happen and the videographer. So now, Brent, if you'd come on, we've got a series of questions here to ask. And so let's get to that. All right. Well, I'm just going to start kind of in order here. And Brent, I'm just going to curate the questions as I get them. So one question, we've only got about a little less than 10 minutes here. So let's move through them here. Was there a lot of wind damage on the watershed during the Columbus Day storm in 1962? Any signs of that?
Yeah, we see a fair amount of that evidence. A lot of that is being harvested, but you can still see a lot of broken tops and legacy evidence of that. If you look closely, that's for sure.
All right. Yeah, if you could speak up a little bit, Brent, your mic's a little bit quiet.
Okay.
So thank you. What kind of review of the harvest plans do you get from the city manager and the water board?
So every fall, I propose a program, and the watershed is managed by the Water and Light Commission, which is a little different than some of the municipalities where I'm dealing directly with the city council. But there's a Water and Light Commission that runs the water for the city. So I bring the plan before them each fall, based on our management plan and our general strategy and set of principles, and with maps and whatever information they need to see what's unfolding and what the plan is. And so they sign off on that and review it, and generally give a tour to the city folks once a year. And so they're real plugged in, and we're the managers, but it's at the direction of the Water and Light Commission.
Yeah, overall they seem to be happy with the kind of the long-term and predictable quality of management. What drove the decision not to use herbicides to improve survival in your vegetation management?
Oh, I think just to be safe. You could argue that, well, a certain amount could be done, could be used. I think it's, and once upon a time, I don't know that anybody cared, but I think at this point, it's particularly valuable, especially with a, quasi-public land like that, to be able to portray our management and show folks what you can do without it, and it's clearly much safer in terms of public relations and for folks that live in McMinnville and that kind of thing. So I think it was just initially it was just playing it safe, and it's worked out real well.
Yeah, and I guess with that longer rotation and all that work in the first 5 to 10 years, you eventually get a well-stocked forest, so it all works out. A question about fuels. Didn't see a lot of surface fuel in the harvest units other than grass and forb. How is it? It sounds like your slash disposal, the harvest system is really reducing that, or do you have high fuel levels somewhere out there?
In places we do, because burning has gotten more difficult to accomplish. We used to burn everything. The one unit you saw in the video, towards the end of the video, we'll be burning those piles. Those are stacked real well. It's a good fit to burn those, but it's got more difficult to burn with smoke management. And then we play it real safe as far as having any fires. So we don't burn till late. We burn when it's real wet. So sometimes you don't get as good a burn. Kind of a trade-off. Obviously if you completely stop, if everybody stops burning, then you've got a lot of fuel sitting out there over time. But anyway, that's been our approach. But in general, probably over the year for 50, 60 years of management, we've burned most everything until the last. It was only in the last 10, 15 years we started burning less, and even then we burned probably half the unit. So pretty good. I feel pretty good about the fuel loading out there.
Okay. Another kind of just generally related question, as far as retention of wood or woody debris, focused on the wildlife habitat and fire protection plan that you have for the watershed. Is it explicitly in the plan about, balancing that amount of wood, wildlife habitat, and also the fire protection plan?
Yeah, that's a balance. One thing with these older stands we never have a shortage of is debris, large woody debris, all sizes of debris in the units, generally. But yeah, we have a range of units around the watershed, a lot of reserve areas. There's a certain amount of emphasis on wildlife. The main goal out there, of course, is water production. So for instance, even some of the things they do with the water in terms of cleaning out and draining the reservoirs, and that's all in the name of the water management. Maybe not as much on the fish side of things and so on, but yeah. So I think that in terms of, there's a certain amount of consideration given to the wildlife. A lot of it is because of our longer rotations and small clear cuts and approach to the streams. Is just again, by virtue of that, good wildlife management.
Okay. Here's another question, kind of the other side of the coin with herbicides is with all the extensive machine operations for scarification, how do you avoid undesirable soil compaction with that extra machine work?
It's again a trade-off. They're already piling, and so they'll swing the brush into piles or the slash into piles. When we generally know up front if we're gonna burn or not. And so if we're not going to burn, then they'll just make a bunch of little piles and make it plantable and scatter more slash. So there maybe wouldn't be as much impact. But I don't know, my view of the compaction is we're only in there intensely only in there every, 70, 80 years. So we haven't seen a real issue with reforestation or anything from compaction in particular. So,
and by operating just in the dry season too.
Right, and that's just one of those trade-offs where we're trying to get, well, we could do less impact maybe from scarification if we sprayed aerially, but that wouldn't, in my view, be a good practice in the watershed. So,
do you have any?
Got to look at the alternatives, So.
Very good. Do you have problems with invasive species that are difficult to control, with that vegetation management that you're doing without herbicides?
In some areas, we've had some Scotch broom come in and some berries, but not generally. And there's the BPA big transmission line runs through a portion of watershed. So up in those areas, we've had, you'll have more Scotch broom come in. There's been more disturbance there, but we'll hand slash that stuff too. It might sound crazy to be out hand cutting Scotch broom, but we've done that. We've done that on some other city properties too, where you're already slashing the alder and maples and larger brush. So while you're at it, get the Scotch broom. And then you're just trying to get above it anyways, and then the trees will outcompete it.
Very good. Have you had any issues with landslides out on the watershed, natural or otherwise?
No. Occasionally we'll have, just the normal stuff of maybe a tree blow over in the buffer and take a chunk of the bank out, and you'll get a little charge of sediment or something. But But yeah, nothing major.
And from all that variety of habitat that you have out there, you probably have a lot of deer and elk populations that are pretty happy. What kind of browsing damage do you have out there?
Oh, it's extensive in areas. We've got a unit we've just about won the battle on after 5 years of interplanting and tubing and so on. Where every time you drive by, there's elk and deer out there, you know. So there's like 3 large groups of elk, it seems like, sometimes come together. They a few years ago, we got that snow, I don't know, kind of the pretty good snow event, and it ran them all into one area, and I think there was 100 elk in one clear cut. And lots of deer. I've driven around there when the weather shifts at certain times of the year or whatever, and seen 40, 50 deer in just a couple-hour drive around the watershed. So certainly, you know, it's no trespassing in there, no hunting. You know, they're really protected, and so there you go. Again, by virtue of just the practices out there, it's a it's a paradise for wildlife. But so, and that's, you know, can be a challenge with trying to get the seedlings going, because on like a south slope, you've already got, especially the last 5 to 10 years where it's been dry in the summer, hard to get the trees growing. Then you got the brush and then real intense browse in places. So that's why that one plantation I said was such a success. That could look rough to someone driving by, but we've fought all those elements. And so to have full stocking at 5, 10 years and know, hey, we don't have to worry, we're off and running with this unit is really satisfying, because there's a lot of challenges to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly noticed a lot of those 10 to 20-year-old areas that looked fine, and they just had a little bit more diverse tree size than you used to see in a lot of plantations. You mentioned
Right.
close to entry or no trespassing. So is the entire watershed closed to public entry and recreation?
That's right. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Does the city ever face litigation or challenges to their forest management practices?
No. You know, I don't, you know, we're not under the same public processes like state forestry or obviously the federal timberlands. And so, no, and I think the public, I've had a lot of folks from the city and city organizations out there. And I think it's been a very well received program, you know, over the years.
All right. Well, here's its question. I'm not sure if you can answer it, but what are the water rates for McMinnville residents for this great water from the watershed?
You know, I don't know that, but I do know I've seen a list or two that they're right around the top 2 or 3 cheapest in the state. I know that much, but I forget the exact rates.
I know reading some of the documents from the water department that they talked about, you know, the timber management income helps keep rates low, among other things, pays for a lot of infrastructure. So I guess that's one of the benefits of that as well.
Right, and it's helped with when they've rebuilt the treatment plant, when they've raised the dam and all those kind of infrastructure projects, new raw water lines to town and so on. That's, yeah, it helps a lot.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you handling this barrage of questions. Here's this one. May have missed it, but is pruning part of the management within the watershed? That was another question.
Nope, we've never done that one. I do remember when, you know, Weyerhaeuser was doing some of that, a big program, and I'm not sure folks have kept up any of those programs. But we've never done that. Just let the trees prune naturally, I guess. And of course, the longer rotation, you can get to that clear wood naturally over time. So
yeah, well, in the end, it looks like you definitely grow some pretty high quality wood. So I think we've covered all the questions. There was one other about riparian areas and forest practices, but you covered that pretty well in the video. So with that, I really want to thank you, Brent, for the day out in the woods with you and for being here with us today and answering the questions, and carry on, and best wishes. And I was glad to see the fire didn't touch your watershed either. That's something to be thankful for.
No, that's for sure. And yeah, around the watershed is the BLM lands, and they've done a lot of management and are doing even more all the way around it. So that makes me feel good too. They were pretty secure up there in the coast drain. Yeah, and thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank you, Brent. Thanks again.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Goodbye. All right. Well, we'll move right along to our next speaker in this series. And that is Kevin Bladon. And are you there, Kevin?
Yeah.
Very good. So I'm going to introduce you first, and hopefully your PowerPoint will be queued up here, and I guess you're in control of that. So Kevin's going to talk to us about post-fire assessment and management impacts on water resources. He's an associate professor, forest ecohydrology and watershed science in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. His research program is focused on understanding the range of effects from wildfires and forest management activities on hydrology, water quality, aquatic ecosystem health, and downstream community drinking water supply. And I don't have much else on your background, but I know I met you soon after you got to the College of Forestry from across the border, I believe, up in Canada. So really glad to have you, and take it away with your show here, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay. Folks see my screen okay, I assume?
Looks great.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. It's really unfortunate we can't be in person. I always love the SAF meetings, and so great to be a part of this. As if 2020 wasn't tough enough already, along came our fire season this year. It's been certainly an interesting and busy one. As Glenn mentioned, for those that don't know me, my research program for the last about 15 years has been focused on land use, land cover change, effects on a range of water values. But the principal focus has been on the effects of wildfire, and then our response to that and post-fire management effects on water quantity, quality, aquatic ecosystem health, and then linking that up to challenges for community drinking water supply. And so today, in the short time that we have, I'd just like to take the helicopter up to 10,000 feet and walk through what we might expect from some of the wildfires we've had this year in Oregon. And so I think most of you are well aware of the current wildfire regime and the trends. This is a figure showing the annual area burned in the United States from 1960 up until this most recent year. And we certainly aren't finished yet. We're well ahead of pace for this time of year compared to other years. The big thing to take from this, though, in 1960 to 2019, we had an annual average area burned of about 4.6 million acres per year. But we see this inflection point in the late 1990s and has persisted up until the most recent years. And then if we look just at the top 10 years on record, put in order of the largest to the smallest in the top 10, you can see that those top 10 have all occurred since 2004 with an average area burned of 8.9 million acres. So more than 2 times or approximately 2 times the long-term average of which they are a part of. And so with the greater area burned comes greater costs. This is a figure showing the annual suppression costs for these wildfires from a federal level. And so from 1985 to 2010, while there's a slight increase over that period of time, the annual average was about $800 million. Whereas the last 10 years, we've seen a real jump to an average of about $2 billion a year for suppression costs, with 3 of the last 4 years. And I say 3 of the last 4 because 2020 is not on this figure, but the current estimates are that we're going to exceed $3 billion in 3 of the most recent 4 years. And so I think those are numbers that many of you have heard and you're aware of and we think of and we get concerned about in terms of the fire regime, but something we really don't hear about quite often are the the true costs associated with wildfire and what are those costs after the fire is out. And so these are things like loss of recreational value, loss of the natural resource base, which many of you are familiar with, long-term impacts on water supplies. And so natural resource economists who've taken a stab at this and tried to put the dollars and cents to this have estimated that the true costs, those post-fire costs, are anywhere between 2 to 30 times the suppression costs. And so certainly the true costs associated with the Labor Day fires this year in Oregon, we expect to be linked to those longer term impacts on water supply. This bullet point here at the bottom, in a conversation with the Oregon Water Utilities Committee a couple weeks ago, they estimated that about 23 of the small utilities in our state had been impacted in one form or another. Some burned completely to the ground, others slightly damaged, and others like Salem and Eugene, large communities had fairly substantial areas of their source water impacted by these fires. And certainly the communities are concerned and are being active. These are a couple of photos. I was out with the folks from eWeb a couple of weeks ago, and we launched a couple of instruments to collect water samples and to monitor stream water quality continuously so we can get a sense of what the initial effects might be on our water supply. And we did this both in the McKenzie Basin for the Holiday Farm fire, but also up in the Beachy Creek fire area in the headwaters for the city of Salem. And so I think, if we think about this and wonder, well, what are the effects likely to look like? Step back actually before we get into that. I think if we've been paying attention, this fire season shouldn't have come as a surprise to us. Fire scientists have been saying this type of fire season is likely to happen. It's likely to continue to happen. And so I think certainly we really need to try to collect as much information from these fairly unique fires on our west side forests in Oregon to try to understand those effects and prepare our communities and forests to be resilient in the face of the types of changes we might expect in future years. And so then thinking about what those effects might look like, we zoom way out. This is a figure from some research some colleagues of mine did at a global level. We're looking to try to identify places on the planet that might be really exposed to the effects of wildfire. And so we brought together various layers that were available to us regarding where's the probability of wildfire? Where are our forests that are so critical to our water supply? Where are the people in the communities in relation to both of those things? And when we bring those together and we isolate just the Pacific Northwest, what we found is this region falls out in somewhere in the upper 30 to 35% of areas globally with high potential for fires to negatively impact our water supplies. And so while that's a model, and it'll be interesting to see how that bears out in the coming years, we also recently completed a study looking at 162 different fires. We had 5 years of pre-fire data, 5 years of post-fire data in these studies, and included a real range in area burned and fire severity, including some prescribed fires and some of the really large wildfires like we've observed this year. And so some of the big take homes from this are that, well, yeah, if we burn more area, we're going to see greater increases in stream flow. And for many of you, compared to other places in the world, we don't use prescribed fire nearly as much as those other places. But if we're thinking about it from a water supply perspective, I understand there's other trade-offs here, but just from a water supply perspective, compared to wildfires, these effects are really quite benign, both in terms of quantity and quality. We also dug a little deeper, trying to look at what are the driving factors leading to these changes in stream flow. Like I said, yes, area burned is key, but so was burn severity. With higher burn severity came much greater changes in stream flow. And then the other one, which is really out of our control and will be really interesting to see what happens as we move into fall and winter here is that post-fire precipitation. And so depending on what we get in terms of inputs, the wetter the year, more likely to see changes. And that's certainly not surprising, but something to be aware of and to think about when we're thinking about what effects we might expect to see. Other questions I've been getting a lot recently are, well, how long are the effects likely to last? Colleagues and I have been working on this review in Mediterranean climates, similar to us, where you've got hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. And of those, we were able to find 30 studies that could lend some insights into recovery and longevity of effects. And so what's shown here in the figure on the x-axis are the post-fire years that we have data. We have just different study numbers on the y-axis, and the black figures are those studies that they assumed that we had some sort of hydrologic recovery. The red are those that we hadn't seen any recovery. And so more than half of the 30 studies, we still saw effects from those fires on hydrology 5+ years after the fire. And most of that was really tied up in, again, area burned and burn severity. So beyond that 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, like you saw in the previous figure, we don't have a lot of good information. I was really fortunate to be part of this study with a couple of other folks from the U.S. Forest Service and Washington State University. And we published this earlier this year. Many of you may have heard of the ENIAT Watershed study. This was a study that was established in the early 1960s with the intent to investigate the effects of forest management on water quantity and quality. And they collected 10 years of pre-harvest data. And the year that they were supposed to harvest, well, all 3 of those watersheds burned as part of the ENIAT fire. And so a real shift in focus. And you can see in this image that they collected that post-fire data for 7 years. And in those 7 years, we saw really demonstrable changes in stream flow, 200 to 300% increases in peak flow. We saw elevated low flows and overall increases in runoff ratios as well. Well, where it gets really fortunate and fortuitous for myself is, well, 35 to 41 years later, we were able to go back and re-gauge these 3 watersheds. And so a really important aspect of this study, which is quite unique and valuable, these 2 watersheds, the green and the purple here, are 2 watersheds that were salvage logged. And at the time they were reseeded, aerially seeded and fertilized. Well, Fox Creek, the one in the orange, was left to recover on its own. And so 35 to 41 years later, we come back and what we see is those 2 that were salvage logged had recovered and returned to pre-fire levels in terms of runoff ratios, where we still saw evidence of elevated annual yields, runoff ratios, and peak flows in that watershed that was left to recover on its own. Now, with elevated flows, one of the things we're always really concerned about is increases in erosion and the things that come along with it. These are some results from the Stouts Creek wildfire that happened several years ago, southeast of Roseburg, on soil hydraulic properties. And on the x-axis, all this is hydraulic conductivity within the soil. So once water is able to enter the soil, how easy is it for that water to move through the soil? And what we observed is about 2 to 3 times greater hydraulic conductivity. Well, that's important and interesting. The y-axis here is far more important. What this is infiltrability or sorptivity, the ease with which water can enter into the soil. And what we observed here is a 2 to 3 order of magnitude lower infiltrability in that high burn severity site relative to those unburned and moderate burned sites. And this is consistent with the literature. In other words, when we have rain events, those first rain events, there's less likelihood of that water entering in the soil, more likelihood of it flowing over the surface. And with that then comes concerns about erosion. So here in Oregon, I'm thinking about, well, what type of erosion rates might we expect? These are some results from a model that John Moody and others did a few years ago, looking at post-fire erosion rates. And so these aren't just erosion rates, post-fire erosion rates and what we might expect to see. And here in Western Oregon, where we've had our major fires, and down in the south in Medford, we kind of pop out somewhere in that top about 1/3 in terms of the likely erosion rates we might expect to see, and has a lot to do with our wet climates, the steep slopes, and the local geology, which is much more conducive to erosion than in some of these other areas. And so with that erosion, we may see increases in turbidity and sediment concentrations in our streams. It's really uncertain what magnitude are we likely to see, and how long might those effects persist. And so, borrowing from some research from the Rocky Mountains, we can get some insights into what that might look like. These are results from a fire that happened in 2003 in the Rockies. The green bars are the green bars are unburned reference sites. The black bars burned watersheds, and then the orange bars are the burned and salvage log watersheds. And what we see from this, that in those burned watersheds, anywhere from 2 to 20 times higher sediment concentrations than the reference watersheds, and persisting for a decade after this fire. And while the salvage log sites in this case seem to make things worse, in that we had anywhere from 2 to 37 times greater sediment concentrations in our streams in those salvage log watersheds. And so the great thing about this study that I love is being able to juxtapose that against this study, which we were able to complete just last year. This is from a study down in just west of Sacramento, the Valley Fire in California. And we were able to compare burned watersheds versus salvage log watersheds versus those that were salvage logged and subsoiled. We also have some subsequent data that's coming on all of these sites that we added herbicide application to them, but those results are delayed. But just looking at this, though, it was surprising for us to find that our burn sites that were left alone, we observed higher sediment yields than we did in our salvage log sites. And that persisted for 2 to 3 years after the Valley Fire. And the big thing that really drove this, when we looked into what are the main factors behind this, was the cover, the ground cover, in that wood cover, that our salvage log sites, a lot of woody material was left on those sites, and was really quite effective at mitigating the erosion we might expect off of some of these hill slopes. And so sort of foreshadowing and to stay tuned, other things to come on those same sites, we also did some overland flow simulations where we're comparing salvage log sites to /covered, /packed sites, subsoiled sites, at their effectiveness at mitigating erosion. And so those results are forthcoming in the future year. And I know many of you will be interested in that, as it can really inform some of our decisions. Other questions that I get quite often are, okay, great, well, we get some erosion and sediment that maybe moves off of these hill slopes. What does that mean when it hits our systems? Does it propagate downstream to our communities and drinking water supply? This is a study where we were able to launch these little Phillips samplers here. They're passive sediment samplers. They allow water and sediment into them, the fine sediment. And you can see in this figure on the left side, the gray area is the burn area. And then there was a drinking water reservoir here, 50 kilometers, about 30 miles downstream from the fire. And these red dots represent all the locations where we launched these Phillips samplers. And so we collected samples of sediment from these, as well as from in the reservoir, and looked at the chemical character of them. And the chemical character of the fire itself has a very unique characteristic. And from that, we were able to identify where the source of sediment was coming from. And what we found was, greater than 80% of the sediment in our reservoir was coming from that very small 14% of the landscape which was burned. And so our burns can be a disproportionate source of sediment to our downstream reservoirs and communities. And so something really for us to think about and ponder, and especially with the current year, and also other places that have had fires near their reservoirs. Many of you may know of Strontia Springs in Colorado, where they spent upwards of $30 million to remove the sediment from their reservoir, which filled a football field to 61 meters in depth. And the problems with that obviously are losses in reservoir storage capacity and delivery of contaminants, and increases in algal blooms in those reservoirs. And so, like I say, it'll be interesting to see what lies ahead for communities like Salem and Detroit Lake, which had fairly substantial areas in and around their reservoir burn this summer. So in terms of impacts and implications for our communities, this is just a table showing some of the main drinking water treatment processes that are available, and we have all of these throughout our state. The big take home here is that these conventional drinking water treatments are really the only treatment process that is designed to deal with consistently high turbidity and consistently high organic carbon. Any of the other treatment plants are going to be faced with some real challenges if they have elevated turbidity or carbon. And so what that might look like, again, we have to rely on studies from other regions. This is again from the Rocky Mountains, and on the left is dissolved organic carbon, on the right is turbidity. The green line is the unburned reference watersheds. The orange are burned watersheds. This is 5 years worth of data. And on the x-axis is the proportion of time that carbon or turbidity is above the value on the y-axis. And what I've added here, this horizontal dashed line, is that line consistent with the threshold where we would want some sort of conventional treatment plant in place in our communities. And what we observed here was that for those first 5 years, that's almost 75% of all of our organic carbon was above that threshold, and about 40% of our turbidity was also above some threshold where the community would be challenged if not for some sort of conventional treatment plant. Okay, other water quality parameters we're interested in, obviously the basic limiting nutrients, and there's a lot of uncertainty around what we might see. I think many of us are really interested to know what's going to happen with phosphorus. Places like the McKenzie, there's many areas that have very high phosphorus concentrations, and so wondering what that might look like post-fire. This is just one study that shows that, well, as long as we had sediment moving into these streams, the phosphorus tend to adsorb to its surface and move down into the system. And so we had elevated phosphorus for a decade after this fire. While nitrogen, well, we see really strong increases in the first few years. Much of that nitrogen tends to be in a more soluble form like nitrate, and is much more mobile and moves out of the system very rapidly in the first few years. And really consistent with most of the literature outside of a few studies, like from Chuck Rhodes' group in Colorado, who's observed a strong nitrogen signal persistent for a decade. And so I don't think we really know what to expect here from these two nutrients, but it'd be really interesting to observe. Our biggest concern with these is how it might change our aquatic ecosystems. And so in this system where we continue to have increases in nitrogen and phosphorus, these were oligotrophic systems, nutrient poor. Really, you'd struggle to find much in the way of algae in most of these systems, very clear, clean water. But this was the type of thing we observed for at least a decade after the fire, very strong increases in algal biomass. That change in algal biomass then also led to changes in our aquatic ecosystems. Just some measures of invertebrate abundances. We saw 2 to 3 times more invertebrates in our burned and salvage log systems, and those communities really changed in their nature. So what this is are figures showing the ratio of EPT to D. So Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera, mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, and their ratio to Diptera or true flies. And so we know that these critters here on the left tend to be or tend to prefer cleaner water quality, whereas the Diptera is much more of a trophic generalist. And what we saw, very strong increases in those trophic generalists in the burn affected watersheds, 8 to 16-fold differences in these ratios. And then continuing to follow that down, we collected fish and we aged them with their otoliths, and so we knew and isolated fish, in this case cutthroat trout, that had spent their entire life history in the post-fire burned environments, and found that those in those burned environments tended to be larger and longer fish relative to the unburned communities. And so this is consistent with what others are seeing. These are some model results from Becky Flitcroft at the U.S. Forest Service, who modeled the Wenatchee Basin in Washington. And on the left are the pre-fire habitat quality estimates. In the middle here is the post-fire, and then on the far right is the difference. And so anything that's red was a decrease in habitat quality, gray, no change, blue was an increase. And you can see for the most part that we see gray or blue, so no change or an increase in habitat quality. And so this is what I love about looking at this from all the different angles, is that, you know, in some cases we see really demonstrable negative impacts, but in other cases we see some winners from these fires. And so important for us to consider this and what we might expect from a really holistic perspective. What can we expect in Oregon? I think it's still uncertain. These fires on the west side are of this nature are really quite new to us, and we don't really have the research on the nutrients and things like metals and changes in quantity and what those impacts might look like for our ecosystems and our communities. And certainly we have lots of great baseline research here that we can build from, and will help us to disentangle the effects from fire from other factors. But I think there are a lot of uncertainties that exist right now. So it'd be really cool to see what comes in the next few years. Some things to watch for. I have a grad student who we started down a path where we parameterized this large-scale hydrologic model SWAT for the North Santiam and Mackenzie River basins. We started a year plus ago, and we're thinking about different wildfire scenarios to lay onto this to project, hey, if we had a year like this, and so, well, we have our fire scenarios. And so we're right at that stage of now starting to run those models, and that will create some really nice testable hypotheses about what we might expect to see. Also working with the EPA to develop some state level maps where we might understand what fish habitats are going to be vulnerable or more resistant to these wildfire effects, and really might help us to guide some targeted management. Other things that we are just starting to work on or would like to work on, working with Pete Robichaud from the U.S. Forest Service. We were out on the Riverside farm on Tuesday. There's us collecting some ash samples that we're going to use to develop some ash yield models to look at some threat assessments for these wildfires. We've also established plots on the Beachy Creek and Holiday Farm fire to do something similar. And would love to partner with any of our industry folks that have been impacted in our salvage logging to do some of those studies that we've done in California, so we can bring some of this information closer to home. And so those are things we're hoping to tackle in the coming years. And so with that, I'll stop and happy to answer any questions that you folks might have.
All right, very good. Thank you, Kevin. We do have some questions, so let's get to those. And I see a lot of acknowledgements there. So you're already tapped in with a lot of partners. So that's good to see, because I expect you'll get some more knocking on your door. Do you expect hydrophobic soil properties after these severely burned sites on those sites from the Labor Day fires, from what you've seen or what you expect, and what impact will that have? Would you speculate on that?
Yeah. So our initial on the ground assessments from all the 3 fires I mentioned that we've been on to, Holiday Farm, Beachy Creek, and the Riverside fire, there was evidence of what I considered to be moderate water repellency. And my expectation, just from what we observed, is that will be fairly short-lived. We're likely to see that through the first events of this year, and will contribute to much of the erosion we would expect. But the issues in terms of runoff and erosion are likely going to be tied up in the ash. There's a lot of ash on the ground, and the soil structure in many of our steep slopes has really changed dramatically. And you can see that already we've had one event, fairly small rain event, and all these sites, that whole system has already started to sort of collapse in on itself. And we see fairly low infiltration rates with some of our very quick infiltration measurements we've taken on those sites relative to the nearby unburned that we've collected already.
Sounds like you're already monitoring that situation.
Correct.
The Willamette River has a total maximum daily load assessment for mercury for some of the segments, including reaches that are going to get runoff with these burned areas. Any comments on potential impacts to mercury loads?
Yeah, I'm aware of a couple of post-fire studies that have quantified mercury. I think I've had discussion with some other folks about interest in the need to collect some additional mercury. I've seen in some of these very high severity fires in unique locations, Rocky Mountains, really disconnected from any type of industry, and yet we've seen exceedingly high concentrations of mercury, concerning levels of mercury that then have shown up in the fish. I really don't know. I don't know. I think most of that is going to be transported and deposited for, based on from industrial emissions. So I really can't comment on it. We've seen in locations we wouldn't expect high concentrations, and other places we would expect where nothing has shown up. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see, and other metals.
All right, there's another question about toxins from burned buildings. The kinds of things that might show up, because there are quite a few buildings, unfortunately, that were in, along the rivers and in the burned areas. What do we know about that as an issue? Toxins from burned buildings, the towns that burned. Any comment on that, or where that shows up?
I guess first comment is I'm a forest hydrologist, so spend the majority of my time up in forest, but I'm well aware of this as an emerging area of concern. Some of the fires that occurred in California really sort of brought this to the forefront in the last couple of years, where we did see those communities burn, and we saw very different pollutants end up in our water systems. From a community perspective, the one thing I will say, I'm increasingly impressed with our drinking water treatment facilities and the drinking water treatment engineers and their ability to ensure the safety of our drinking water. They may be challenged by this, and we'll keep a lot of them up at night and keep them busy, but impressively, they are on top of these sorts of contaminants as much as they can be, and trying to remove them to ensure the safety of our drinking water.
Well, with that in mind, with the data that you showed on the kinds of treatments and the expected kinds of loads that might exceed different treatments, are you in a position, or is there help for our watersheds, for Salem and the McKenzie there, for those water system folks to get some help to see what they're going to be up against and what measures they should be prepared to take?
Yeah, to be honest, I've been really blown away at the people that have come out of the woodwork to try to help. There's a large contingent of folks. We had a call earlier today with folks from the USGS and the Forest Service and the utilities from across the states or across the state. There are folks from locations that haven't been impacted that are also tuning in and paying attention and lending their advice and information. And we have deployed a lot of sensors across these watersheds to try to capture some of that initial response. I am concerned for some of the communities. They're really going to face some tough challenges based on the infrastructure they have in place and the types of changes they're going to see in their water quality. But they're out in front of it, which is great news.
Here's another question. How do fire responses compare to typical harvest response in terms of affecting water quality? So if you just look at some of the watershed studies of harvested watersheds versus not, you can compare that to the burned watersheds.
Yeah, well, to me, you think about end members. Wildfires are end members in terms of the types of effects that we can see on water, and comparatively, forest management effects are really quite benign. The footprint is nowhere near what we see with wildfire severity. The impacts to our soils they're not comparable. Some of these areas of high severity burn where we dug down on Tuesday. We had an individual with us and asked, can I dig down and see? Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. And so they spent a little while digging through, and the depth of burn in some of these locations, it's not going to be long before we're eroded right down to bedrock. And we saw that at the Stouts Creek fire. The first rain events, just whole hillsides coming down and moving so much more sediment. So to me, they're not even comparable in terms of disturbances.
Well, what you just said is somewhat terrifying for the communities that we look at, these watersheds that are burned ridgetop to ridgetop.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost sounds like you just have to tell people to get out of the way, in some of these places. I mean, what can be done?
I certainly don't. Yeah, I don't think we want to create panic. I think that what a great system we have in place. We have the burned area emergency rehabilitation teams, the BEAR teams. They've already been on site. So those teams go to every fire in Oregon over 500 acres. They sent their best teams here. And they didn't use local people. They sent the best teams in because there was a recognition that there are a lot of values at risk here. And so as part of their assessment, they're looking at things like water repellency and slope steepness and sort of adjacency to streams and communities. And then from that, the follow-up is going to be a report and on that threat assessment and some recommendations of, okay, what types of things might we do to mitigate in those really high threat areas? Are there things we can put on our hill slopes to mitigate that threat and hold those slopes in place and help to stabilize them? Are there things we can do in stream? They'll go all the way downstream and look at different culverts and make recommendations about, you're going to need to resize these culverts and get ahead of this as quickly as possible. And so with that in mind, they've already been on site and are working through those sorts of things quickly.
That is what I wanted to hear, because I've been out in the field sites, and that's one of the number one questions is people say, well, who's looking out to see where these higher hazard areas are and what should we be doing either to mitigate it or, again, get to a safety zone if some of these things are imminent. Well, very good, Kevin. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Thanks for having me.
On short notice, we knew we needed you with this, the Labor Day fire situation, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, very good. We need to move on to our next session here. So thanks again, Kevin. And it's time to get Mike Cloughesy and John Souder on board.
All right.
All right. So first I get to introduce you.
Yeah, you got it. We won't talk until you introduce us. We just want to use every second we have. You know us.
That's very good. All right. So we'll get John and Mike on here. And so we have two speakers for our session on trees to tap, understanding effects of forest management on source water. And first, Mike Cloughesy hardly needs introduction after. I want to say congratulations on that Lifetime Achievement Award. And I am another person who's benefited greatly from your mentorship and in SAF and in our profession, Mike. So I really appreciate you, and I'm glad you're here for a little longer amongst us before you retire. So I know Mike from early days as an extension forester. So before he became a director of forestry at OFRI in 2003, he was one of my colleagues in extension early on and a mentor there. So I'm glad to see you, moving on to this level and helping us out at the state level with OFRI. And Mike, of course, is one of the principals with OFRI with this study with John Souder. And I will introduce John as well. And John, actually, I got to be on the search committee when we found John to take over after Paul Adams as our Forest Watershed Extension Specialist. John is an assistant professor and specialist in Forest Watershed Extension. He's got an appointment with OSU in Forest Engineering, Resources and Management, and also, again, as an extension specialist. Prior to OSU, when he came in 2015, he was the executive director of the Cloughesy Watershed Association for 15 years. And he had extensive experience working on all aspects of watershed restoration, enhancement, and science. Before that, he worked with fish and wildlife biology in Arizona with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Mexico. And he also taught at Northern Arizona University. So John has an extensive background in forestry and watershed science. And so we have John and Mike to talk to us about trees to tap.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. We're doing this as tag team, and you'll see our slides are color coded. So the very first slide that we just went by is orange and black. So that means it's a John slide. So John goes first.
So one of the reasons that I was interested in working with OFRI in this study, other than the dean coming to us and saying he'd like us to do it, is that through the work that I've done in forestry really over the last 30 years or so, one of the things that I've noticed is that there seems to be a perception on a lot of people's part that forest practices haven't changed substantially since the early days in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think these sets of photographs from the ALSI study really epitomize that difference between 1960s era logging practices, and this is Needle Branch Creek on the top there, and on the bottom as well. And what we're seeing is, I think, a lot of people, and particularly on the part of the public, but a lot of the people who work with forestry, still having this perspective that upper picture is how forestry is practiced today. And I think a lot of us recognize that we're that procedures and protocols and laws and regulations over the past 50 years or so have really changed the way that forestry is practiced, but that recognition is not necessarily out there in terms of the people who are working with regulatory agencies or the general public. And so that was really why I was intrigued to get involved in the study, so that we could start hopefully revising those perceptions and bringing things up at least into the 21st century with it.
All right.
Okay.
So as John mentioned, Anthony Davis approached him because we approached Anthony Davis. As you know, OFRI does science-based education for the public and for landowners, and water quality, especially drinking water quality, was becoming a big issue. And so we looked at the science that we had available to us, and the last big study that brought it all together on drinking water was done by Paul Adams and Mark Teratute, OSU Extension, in 2000. So you can't use 18-year-old studies and say that's what we need. So we approached Dean Anthony Davis and said we would like OSU College of Forestry to do this study for us. And right away, he put together a team, came back to us, and he said, well, what we'd like you to do is to work with the Institute for Natural Resources. We'd like John Souder to be the lead, and this is why. And so we went through a good discussion and came up with a team. But what we're trying to do is to synthesize the current science about the impacts of forest management on community drinking water supplies. We're not looking at fish. We're not looking at anything else. We're just looking at community drinking water supplies. And we wanted to describe and analyze the management of forested community drinking water supplies. And we wanted to have it done in 6 months. Well, that part didn't happen. The rest did. It was completed in June of 2020, and we involved an incredible science team that John put together. He was the PI. As you know, he's the Extension Watershed Specialist. Co-PIs included Kevin Bladon, who we just heard from, did most of the work on sediment and on water quantity. Emily Jane Davis, Extension Specialist on Collaboration, was our resident sociologist. She handled the surveys, interviews, and the case studies. Bogdan Strimbu, Forest Management System Professor, did the chemicals and some other stuff. And the real star of our team, I got to say, all of these PhDs were great, but Jeff Bean was our specialist in searches. And he was an incredible searcher using Google Scholar and really specializes, as John has worked with him a lot in the INR, specializes in systematic evidence review. So that was kind of the tack we wanted to take. We also, and this I really want to compliment John for insisting on it, and compliment OFRI for being willing to accept it. We had a very diverse steering committee, both personality-wise and who they represented. And I think that adds to the value of the study and the value of the report going forward. So what we tried to do is look at active forest management and the drinking water. We already knew going in from studies that DEQ and others had done that forested watersheds produce the highest quality drinking water in the state, but we wanted to look at specific forest management activities and how they impact the drinking water. So the ones that the steering committee came up with that they thought were the most important were timber harvest, forest roads, and chemical applications. And then as we dug deeper, we learned about dissolved organic matter, which wasn't even on our plate. The impacts that we again identified from our steering committee that we wanted to find out about was sediment input in the streams, changes in water quantity, and chemicals in the water. And we also wanted to look at the role of the Forest Practices Act and the BMPs of protecting these impacts. Started off with the survey of the community drinking water systems, and here it was a lot easier because when Paul and Mark did this in 2000, GIS hadn't been invented very good, and we didn't have a lot of the information that we do now. So existing, there was good databases by DEQ and Oregon Health Authority that told us where these water systems were, and it was much easier. So we were able to identify that there were 156 drinking water providers in Oregon that rely on surface water. We weren't looking at groundwater, just surface water, and predominantly we were looking at forested watersheds. We saw that some of these had industrial timberland, was mainly what the land was within the watershed. Others were public forest land, like Forest Service type. And the third type would be like the one we just heard of, the McMinnville one, where it's public land owned by the local government. And so we wanted to get a mixture of all of these. We had a target, and our final response, we met the target, not without a lot of persistence by Emily Jane and John and Mike Collier from our steering committee, but we got 54 systems to respond to our survey, 35%. They had some concerns that they identified. Number one was potential wildfire impact. So they kind of were prophetic there. Number two was turbidity and suspended sediment, forest chemicals, increased wildfire risk due to management, and finally, future water quantity. And we thought these were great things. The other thing that the survey identified for us was we asked them, Emily Jane asked them about who do you work with? The number one group that these water masters, water suppliers, water systems worked with was private forest landowners. They identified those ahead of watershed councils, ahead of soil and water conservation districts. So obviously there was a natural place for us to be playing. The science review was very deep. This was prioritized topics by the steering committee, but led by Jeff Bean, who identified the articles, which were then reviewed by our scientists, by John, Bogdan, and Kevin. And what we found was there were a lot of studies out there. They identified over 750 articles that met the 200 keyword strings. They generally tried to look at the stuff since the year 2000, used Google Scholar, but also used some other databases. The search terms that they looked for were there on the left. Active forest management and water quantity, active forest management and sediment and turbidity, forest chemicals and drinking water, and active forest management and natural organic matter. With that, I'll toss the ball back to John and he'll tell us what they found.
So thanks, Mike. So one of the things that we found is that there's incredible variability out there, and that even though we may have started with 750 studies on it, we found actually very few where the researchers evaluated the direct connection between active forest management and water quality at the raw water intake. So we were pretty careful with how we made inferences between the two, but if we had just relied only on those studies that looked at active forest management and water quality at the raw water intake, we would have had a handful or fewer. So a couple of the general findings and certainly the caveats that we gained through looking at this data is that watershed size matters. And so here in this figure, you've got the city of Oceanside that's on the coast, has a small 2 square mile watershed. So that's about a third of the size of the city of McMinnville's for it, versus the city of Sweet Home that's taking water from the South Santiam River, and their watershed that contributes to their water supply is 564 acres. So 250 times the size of Oceanside. So that, active forest management is going to have different effects in those different sized watersheds. Geography is important, particularly as it relates to rainfall patterns and whether the water supply is driven by rain, as it is on most of the coast and in the Coast Range, or if it's driven by snowmelt, as it is in much of the Cascade area. Geology is also important. We've got areas down on the coast that are Tyee sandstone, and we have areas in the Cascades and other places that are basalt. And those two geologies act entirely different, both in terms of the general morphology of the watershed, the steepness of the slopes, the thickness of the soils, and all of those are important in terms of how active forest management affects water quality in the streams below them. Also, there's a diversity of land ownership in these watersheds. Again, most of the watersheds in the Cascades have a substantial amount of federal land ownership in them, and those lands are managed under the Northwest Forest Plan and are typically pretty lightly managed in comparison to, say, the industrial lands that are lower elevation and predominate on the coast as well. And then also, it's not just forest management that's affecting source water quality at the intake. It depends on the land uses that are between the forest and the intake. And again, that varies substantially depending on where you are. So for instance, if we look at eWeb, which Kevin talked about and is a really good example, most of eWeb's water is generated up in the Cascades on Forest Service or on BLM lands, but the intake for the City of Eugene's water system is in downtown Springfield. And so you have that lower valley along the McKenzie River, and then plus you have all of that urban area in the city of Springfield that's also contributing to that water quality as it before it gets to the intake. So it's important to not focus solely on the forestry piece of this, but to also look at what are the other land uses in the area. And we saw a number of examples where actually that had some substantial effects on the water quality. And finally, a lot of the studies that we looked at were conducted in upper watershed areas in these small first, second, third order streams. And it's very difficult to extrapolate from those smaller watersheds and to basically scale up into bigger areas. And we just don't have those studies of the larger areas to be certain that what we're seeing in smaller areas is also scales up to larger areas. So that's an area, that would be an area hopefully for some additional research for it. So with those caveats in mind, so if we look at water yield, and Kevin had some good stuff after fires for this, but forest management also has somewhat similar, although much more moderate effects on water quantity yields. So what happens when you harvest timber? And so what are the effects on water quality when you harvest timber? Essentially forest hydrology 101. So with fewer trees, you get less evapotranspiration, which means there's more water that reaches the ground that stays in the ground. You have less interception by needles during rainfall events. So you get more of that water again hitting the ground and running off or going into the shallow soil layer for that. And in areas that have snow-driven systems, you also may be getting different levels of snowfall accumulation as a result of those openings and as a result of less snow that's up in the upperly evaporating before it gets into the ground and runs off again. So again, most of the research that we looked at had been done in these smaller basins. And most of the water supplies that we're looking at tend to be in drawing water from larger watershed areas. Although again, that's not entirely the case. We had some very small systems in there. Oceanside was not the smallest, actually. We had some that went down to hundreds of acres for it. So again, the amount of impact is really going to be dependent on the size of the contributing watershed. Okay, so we talked about water quantity changes, and there's really two changes that we see from forest management. And this is some work that Catalina Segura and Kevin was involved with in the ALSI Revisited study. I see George Isis has been on the webinars, and George has been intimately involved with this for quite some time. So if we look at this figure here, that blue line, horizontal blue line across here, these are comparisons between two basins. One is the Flynn Creek, which was the reference site and has been the reference site since the early original ALSI study from 1958 to 1973. So all of these comparisons all of these lines are in comparison to the Flynn Creek with it. So Needle Branch, which was the treatment site, the classic photo that we started with for it. So the wavy lines are essentially the results from needle branch in comparison or subtracted from the Flynn Creek results. And so what we can see, this first blue line up on the top here, this is the first 8 years after the original harvest that were done in the 1960s in 1966. So this is the average of the 8 years after that initial harvest in needle branch. So what you can see is in the winter period here, the rainy period here, is there is more runoff from the Needle Branch watershed in comparison to the Flynn Creek watershed. And the runoff went as much as 100% more in that period. So if you're looking at the kind of water year here going from October through September, you've got increased runoff as a result of the harvest in the wet part of the season. And then as you go over to the summer period here, beginning in about July or so, in the harvested area, you have what are called summer base flow deficits, where there's less water in the harvested area and the replanted area and the plantation than there is in the original unharvested comparison for it. So this is the blue line here is the initial study. Then that site, that Needle Branch Basin was planted, regrew for about 45 years or so, 45 years or so, and then was ready to be harvested again. And so that was the ALSI Revisited study, came into being at that point, and again looked at the base flow for that. And so if we're looking at the base flow for that, that's this kind of more purple line here, where you get in comparison, again, to Flynn Creek, even in the winter, you get less water in the Needle Branch as a 45-year plantation than you get in Flynn Creek as a natural growing stand. And you also get what's potentially more important is in the summer, you also get some fairly substantial deficits, as much as 50% less water in the summer in these actively growing plantations than you would get in a natural unmanaged stand. Okay, so then Needle Branch gets harvested at two different periods, but one harvest is in 2009, this first entry in it. And then you can look at this from the orange and the red lines, is that again, you're starting to see these deficits, summer deficits, as a result of the young, rapidly growing plantations in it. So this seems to be a pattern. So this is ALSI. We've seen this pattern in some other work that Perry and Jones have done that also includes the cascades. And it does basically make sense. I think, you know, when you have these young, dense, actively growing trees that have full canopy coverage for them, we're getting a lot of water that's being taken up by the growing trees, a lot of water that's being evapotranspired through the needles on it. So it's not surprising that we're going to see increased water use in comparison to natural stands that have more openings in them, less canopy cover typically in them. So then if we look at sediment and turbidity, again, there's a lot of good news in terms of sediment and turbidity and the effects of changing practices and the effects of forest regulation, you know, over the last 50 years or so that the Forest Practice Act here and other forest practice laws, subsequent forest practice laws in other states have made. So this table here is an interesting study that Marianne Ryder Weyerhaeuser did in the Deschutes River in Washington, and basically at the kind of downstream end of a larger areas looked at turbidity levels in the water over the winter period. And so what she found in her study is that essentially over time, there really is a direct relationship between the amount of area that is disturbed through harvesting activities and through road construction and the amount of turbidity that shows up in the water. And this is fairly far downstream, so this might be actually closer to what we would see in a typical situation with forest management activities in the upper watershed and water intakes lower down in the system. So the chart here is showing from 1975 to 2006 or so how that has changed over time. And so you have levels of harvest have typically, gone down a little bit, but largely stayed the same. Road construction piece, those white boxes in there have gone down. So the gray boxes are harvest, the white boxes are roads, and this is the percentage of the watersheds with it. And so as the harvests have gone down, the amount of sediment clearly has gone down, since that's a relationship between area harvested and amount of roads built. But what's more interesting as you get over into these more contemporary periods after forest practice rules and harvest methods have changed with it, is that you're getting a lower amount of sediment per percentage of area harvested and disturbed than you had in the past. So that's really an indication that best management practices have been effective in reducing sediment. There's also been a couple of other studies that have looked at some of these long-term sediment deposition. Jeff Hatton in the College of Forestry did a very nice study with a graduate student doing sediment cores in the bottom of Loon Lake east of Reedsport, and actually showed increased sediment levels that correspond or correlate to the institution of regulations under the Forest Practice Act in 1972. So it is nice to see good, strong evidence that the best management practices that are being put into place are having are effective and are having an impact on the amount of sediment. Okay, so another piece, and this is a nice study that one of Kevin Bladon's graduate students, Aaron Rachel's, just completed in 2018 on some Starker ground out west of Corvallis, where he looked at how much sediment is coming off of harvest units, put in some of those samplers, the Phillips samplers like Kevin was talking about, and also had sediment fences throughout the slopes in the watershed. And so what he found through that, again, is that it's the amount of ground cover in the units. So the more ground cover you had, the less sediment you have. And that was consistent with what Kevin was talking about when he was talking about the salvage logging after fires. But also the presence of a riparian buffer. And the riparian buffer was catching a substantial amount of the sediment there, as you can see in the right, where you had the sediment mass collected in the riparian buffer had a medium of 22.4 grams compared to only 8 grams in the buffer itself, and 20 grams or 19 grams in the unit. So again, this is evidence that the riparian management areas and those buffers, are effective in reducing sediment that's going off of the units and coming into the streams. So there is a concern, though, and I think concern that remains, that after harvest, particularly on steep slopes, that the root degeneration that comes typically 5 to 7 years after a harvest can lead to increased landsliding. And again, it's dependent on the slopeness of the steepness of the slope and the depth of the soil on it, and other features such as head walls. But you can have a 2 to 10 times higher level of landsliding after harvest on these steep slopes. And so that's a part that is a real concern on the part of water managers, particularly in these smaller coastal basins where you get those steep slopes and you have very small contributing watersheds. So something that's coming down into a system ends up in their intake very rapidly. So that's the sediment and turbidity story in a nutshell. If we go on to everybody's favorite topic, well, not everybody's favorite topic yet. So let's talk about roads for a second. So I think most people generally recognize today that roads are probably the primary source of sediments going into streams from active forest management. So you've got basically two types of processes that are putting sediment into streams. So you have catastrophic fill failure from roads that comes typically during storm events when a culvert gets plugged and it blows the fill out or it diverts down the road. Or you have chronic sediment yields that are essentially coming off of the surfaces of roads through the breakdown of the aggregate, if the aggregate's not durable, and are typically very responsive to the amount of truck traffic. So if you don't have any traffic on a road in the winter, you're very unlikely to get much sediment runoff from the road, at least from that chronic fine sediment runoff from it. So the best management practices that ODF has to what's called hydrologically disconnect the road surface from the streams are actually very effective in reducing these sediment inputs from essentially a 50% or so of that chronic sediment, up to the point where you can virtually not find any sediment coming off of the road if the BMPs are followed with that. Okay, so if we now go back to everybody's favorite topic of forest chemicals. So herbicides are a tool, a very useful tool in forest management, and a lot of typical forest management is dependent on chemical use. It was very interesting to see Brent and hear Brent talk about the McMinnville watershed and what they've done in order to essentially avoid using chemicals in that watershed, and kind of how involved that's been with them. I looked at about 40,000 notifications as a part of this review from the last 5 years or so, the ODF started the Fern system. And there are about 70,000 herbicide notifications a year that are filed with ODF on it. And that's typically for herbicide use. There's another about 200 applications a year or so for fertilizer use for it. So that's about 1 million acres a year in Oregon that are sprayed, and about 125,000 acres a year that are fertilized for it. So in general, the concerns about herbicide use come from drift, and drift is probably the biggest area of complaints that the state gets over herbicide use. Overland flow, and we don't get a huge amount of overland flow in these systems with it, and movement through soil. So what's the good news for this is that most of the herbicides that are used in forestry are very low in terms of toxicity. Most of them are soluble in water. They don't bioaccumulate. So in terms of their overall nastiness, they have a fairly low impact, I would say, with it. That said, all of the studies that we reviewed did show that through herbicide applications, there was herbicide that was getting into streams. It came either during the application period, when there was spray, when the spraying was done, or it came during the first couple of winter storms for it. Got into the water, it went downstream, it tended to dissipate rapidly for it and get diluted rapidly for it. So it doesn't seem to persist very far down into the system for it. So in that respect, it's seems to be fairly low risk in these systems. But again, low risk from people who are familiar with using herbicides is different than the risk that the general public may perceive from this. So if we look at, oops, going the wrong way here. So if we look at what is used and what's being found in the water sampling that's being done by DEQ, EPA, USGS around the state. So we looked at water sampling records from 1995 to 2020 or so. In about a third of those cases where water was sampled, glyphosate was detected. In about a quarter of those, atrazine was detected, and then it went kind of down. But these are all chemicals on this table that are used in forest management for it. So there is concern on the source of those chemicals. Now, the last time that we knew how many chemicals were really being used and had good data was in 2008 and 2009 when there was a pesticide reporting system requirement. And at that time, only about 3.5% of the chemicals used in Oregon, chemicals meaning pesticides, herbicides, were being used in forestry, which means that 98 or 96.5% of them were being used by agriculture, being used in by residential areas and in urban areas. So that doesn't really let forestry off the hook with it, but in terms of magnitude, it's a relatively minor contributor. And equally, in terms of complaints that the state receives over herbicide application, that's also right around that 3.5% for it. So they, I don't know that most of us recognize, because the aerial herbicide application complaints tend to be in the news so much, but that's actually only a very small percent of the complaints over herbicide use that the state receives. So one of the things that is very clear, and this came out of some studies that were done over west of Corvallis, is that to prevent drift into streams adjacent to the spray operations, you really do have to have a forested buffer for it with it. And so we're not requiring those on in streams, non-fish small streams for it. And that will be a concern, I think, that will come up, and we're seeing that in some of the calls for increased regulation. There are also concerns that most of the studies, and this was consistent with what we found, is that most of the studies look at single chemicals. But yet when we looked at what was being notified for and in common practices, you typically had multiple chemicals being used, and large amounts of chemicals being notified for, and we don't know actually how many were used. But frequently you have these tank mixes of multiple chemicals and that also have various additives, adjuvants in them, and there aren't any studies that are really being done on these mixes. And there are no studies, there's really no registration of adjuvants. So we don't know what the safety is for those. And then finally, I think I read every study that's been done on pesticides in the and particularly herbicides in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the impressions that I got from that is that we don't really have very good monitoring protocols for that. There's not a lot of money going into studies of herbicide use in forestry or even herbicide use otherwise, but particularly in forestry. There are not a lot of these studies. Most of the studies are not what would be called random studies to the effect that the operator in these studies knows that they're being observed during the spray operations. And the types of analysis that are being done, the types of sampling that are being done, are not as effective at determining what the aggregate impact of these applications are. So, I think while the risk is very low, it's very difficult to actually make a credible case that we know what's going on out there with herbicide use. Okay, so keeping on. So then we get into this question of that Kevin talked about a little bit when he started talking about dissolved organic carbon with it. So this question that came up in the steering committee about what is the impact of active forest management on natural organic matter, and dissolved organic matter is a subset of natural organic matter, and disinfectant byproducts. So there is a possibility through active forest management that you're getting more natural organic matter into streams. So a lot of the litter that's left on the ground after operations can move into streams. It can also get dissolved and move into streams for that. And in general, although I certainly trust Kevin's knowledge on this, in general, after fires, a natural organic but a lot of that natural organic matter that's litter on the forest floor, is being volatilized as a result of the fire. So you can get forest management activities increasing natural organic matter in stream, and you can get fires variously increasing different types of it for it. If you get things like a bark beetle infestation, you can actually have some substantial increases in natural organic matter going into stream as a result of those trees breaking down and getting into the water with that. So the reason that we're concerned about natural organic matter, I mean, it's natural in there. Carbon is the foundation for a lot of the life that we see in streams. And Kevin had some good slides about the fact if you increase that, and as well as you're increasing the nitrogen and phosphorus, you're getting a bunch of growth in the streams, and the streams are more productive. But what the water treatment operators are concerned about is that when you get that combination between the carbon in the water and the chlorine that's used to disinfect the water, then you get chlorinated biphenyls and other substances in there that are actually toxic and carcinogenic. So most times those higher levels of natural organic matter get reduced substantially through the treatment processes. But what happens is that you can get stagnant water, and the real problem is if you get stagnant water where you have carbon in association with this chlorine, that's the case when you build up these disinfectant byproducts. So typically when you see that in sampling at a water utility, it's way down at the end of some distribution line where the water has set for some while for it.
Excuse me, John. We just
yeah.
have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure there's times for questions, okay?
Okay, thanks. So let's power through this then. So the other piece that we looked at in this study that was really an add-on was fire risk. And so we had Alan Ager's group at the Forest Service, Chris Ringo and Michelle Day, essentially convert a fire risk program that they'd use for community fire risk and then look at it from a watershed perspective. And so they've mapped out for all of these 156 watersheds, sources and kind of sinks for fire. So where are they originating from and where are they going to and how intense are they? And it will be useful. And I know Chris and Michelle are working right now on looking at the relationship between what we actually have seen in these Labor Day fires and the risk modeling that they did for it. So we will be providing this information and working with water utilities to help them understand their risk and hopefully work with their adjacent landowners to try and reduce wildfire risk for it. Okay, so as Mike mentioned earlier, we did do 3 case studies. So we looked at Ashland, Baker City, and Oceanside to get a geographic distribution and different type of land ownerships with them. And the key lessons from that really is that communication is key. Where we had communication between water managers and land managers, it seemed like any problems and any concerns could get resolved from it. Where there wasn't that communication, we're seeing actually some calls for legislation that would require forest land managers to work with their community water suppliers to resolve their differences. I would point out, based on my experience, that there's a lot of opportunities for joint benefits between water managers and forest land managers. There's funding available to help improve infrastructure, particularly roads, that would reduce sediment sources for it. There's a lot of cost share programs possible for it. The ability to work with your water utility is really going to vary depending on the size of the water utility, though, because bigger ones, when we're talking Salem or Eugene, have a huge amount of capacity, and smaller ones may just be run by volunteers. There's a number of these systems that are just volunteer run for it. Okay. So basically, I would be remiss as an academic if I didn't call for increased research for these things. So we don't know how to scale up effects from these smaller watershed studies to larger municipal watershed size studies for it. So that's an area that we found there were some significant gaps in our knowledge, in our ability to scale up for it. If we're looking at sediment turbidity, it's really these steep landslide prone areas with erosive bedrock that are the largest concern. And again, that kind of typically is more along these smaller coastal watersheds for it. And finally, I think that if we don't get better monitoring and better modeling of forest herbicide use, I perceive that there's going to be some significant problems down the road with the public, with the social license to continue to use herbicides in forestry.
All right, thank you, John. Well, it's time for some Q&A, and we'll end up with some closing remarks from Rex, but I think we've got some time for a few questions here. So I will throw them at you. First off, what's the time frame for short-term impacts after harvest? I guess both Kevin's and your research, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? What are we really looking at as what we'd expect?
Well, it depends on the resource. So if it's water quantity, it's the 5 to 7 years you get increased flows as a result of harvest. But then the summer low flow or base flow deficits appear to go on for, up to 40, 45 years after that. If it is a sediment runoff, I would think that that's probably in the 0 to 10 year period. So you may get some runoff right at harvest, increased runoff right at harvest, but then you've got that period of 5 to 7 years when you're losing the roots out of your stumps, and you're getting piping through those root channels with it that are causing problems.
All right, and Mike, did you want to cover something before I keep going with questions?
You can keep going. I just want to put this up. People can read and listen, I found. And there are some trees to tap products that are available. And Julie has put a link to our website in the chat. The big thing I want to point out is that the science book is coming by OSU, hopefully by the end of this year. And OFRI and OSU are sponsoring a conference aimed at forest managers, water system managers, and regulators on trees to tap. And that's scheduled for March 11th and 12th. And it's being handled by Shannon Murray at the OSU College of Forestry Continuing and Professional Education.
Okay. Here's a technical question. I was recently asked to calculate equivalent clear-cut area for a watershed. The term was new to me. What's your perspective on how good equivalent clear-cut area, ECA, is as a measure of watershed quality or impacts?
I don't have an opinion because I would have to look and see how they're defining equivalent clear-cut area for it.
Okay, well, we'll punt on that one and do some more research.
And I'm happy to correspond with the person that asked that question.
All right, Terry emailed John.
Yeah.
If retaining ground cover post-harvest is important, would you recommend modifying slash piling to avoid areas or change, the way we cover the ground with site prep and slash?
Well, I think that clearly, and again, I think Kevin had that great photograph of the salvaged area after the fire. The more cover, the more slash that you've got on the ground, the more you're going to be able to retain that sediment that's running off. On the other hand, the more material you've got on the ground like that, the more natural organic matter you're also going to be having on the streams. So I think that more cover is better with it. So I would not suggest necessarily raking the forest floor like some have recommended.
Okay, it's a balance. What happened to the pesticide reporting requirement after 2008-9?
Well, basically my understanding of it is that the pesticide users put pressure on the legislature, and the legislature took the funding away for it. So it was never really effectively implemented for it. So there was really only a couple of years with it. I think that's not in the interest of the people using pesticides. I would contend that it's in the interest of the people using the pesticides to be able to let people know exactly what's being used out there and how much, and have good models to evaluate the effect that it's having on water quality in streams. And I think that's particularly important for the forestry sector that actually uses very little herbicide in relationship to the agriculture sector for it. So I think we're seeing some of the reporting requirements that are changing as a result of this bargain that the governor's office brokered between the timber industry and the environmental community. in terms of more real-time reporting of application and use. But even that still doesn't provide the data that would be needed to do an annual report on the amounts of chemicals being applied and where they're being applied and such, and who's applying them, what sector's applying them.
I guess if we have time for another question that related to that, how do the new buffers and regulations regarding forestry herbicide applications and riparian areas, how does that, relate to this conversation?
Well, I think in general, the wider buffers are going to correspond with less chemical coming into the stream. But actually, from the studies that we were looking at, it's more what's in the buffer rather than the width of the buffer that's making the difference. So you can have, if you have no wood or no forest stand or tree stand in the buffer, then you can get quite a bit of drift into the stream. And that's consistent from forestry, as well as there's been a lot more studies that have been done in the agriculture end of things, where they're doing a lot of ground spraying of crops for it. So having a forested buffer is probably more important than having a wider buffer in terms of reducing drift. You can have also a buffer that is too dense, in which case the wind is basically coming up and going over it, and then dropping the drift back behind it in the stream, versus essentially being filtered out through various layers of vegetation between the edge of the spray zone and the creek itself.
Okay. I think I'd better turn it over to Rex at this point, because he's going to wrap up our session. And there's a question here that might relate to your comments, which is what's the opportunity to educate residents and users of the water about this topic and forest management and effects on water supplies. So take it away, Rex.
Well, that was certainly a head full of information there, water, fire, and research. We've heard about modern forest management and municipal clean water and how they're compatible. We also heard some possible impacts of forest management in post-fire treatments and how they can and must be mitigated with contemporary practices. We also heard quite a bit about research and how it's demonstrating that forestry today is prescribed to produce clean water from managed forest lands. But ultimately, Oregon's sound forest management, sustainable into the future, will rely on strong laws that are science-based to do a good job at protecting water resources during management and post-fire activities. These Oregon water protection laws and regulations are a successful package. That package of 6 items are proven performance to keep Oregon's forest water clean while we professionally manage. So what are those 6? We have a combination of forest practice regulations, land use regulations, fire protection regulations, Oregon plan voluntary water enhancements, and cooperative stewardship amongst landowners, operators, and the State Department of Forestry. And lastly, as we heard about in the last presentation, research cooperating with professional foresters is an important part of our package of how we work together as professional foresters to keep our forest water clean and keep our work sustainable into the future. So with that, I should close the program and turn it over to Julie.
Yeah, let's just thank everybody from this session.
Yeah, thank you very much,
water.
the speakers. I appreciate the panelists, Dr. John Souder, Dr. Kevin Bladon, and Brent Keller, and Glenn Ahrens. You did a great job, Glenn, at moderating those questions. So
And
thank
Mike
you.
Cloughesy is a mastermind behind
Does
it
that
all.
mean you don't appreciate me, Rex?
Yeah, I really appreciate you, Mike, and Julie.
I'm
Julie
feeling
more than
better
you, Mike.
already. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rex. Thanks, Glenn. And as mentioned, all the speakers from that panel really appreciate them all putting that together. The Trees of Tap has been a long process, and it's nice to see the research been coming out, and really encourage everyone to join us at the larger conference coming up in 2021. So much more to learn from that. It was just a great start today.